way he sat on it, and he kept throwing them back to the general rapture of the onlookers. He was middle-aged, late 40s by his look, and his body was beginning to run into the zone of comfortable fat that seemed the providence of men on the cusp of old age. He'd come here every night for the last week, and for the last week, I'd come here to observe him. I knew his name, which was a rarity. Most of them were just part of the faceless mass. Some of them would remain faceless forever, but some of them were known to me before the end. I was their shadow, the one who knew their secrets, and the one who ushered them from life to death. At that moment, I remembered my first. They say you never forget your first, and I can assure you that's the case. How could I forget her? She ushered me into the world of the living, so it was only fair that I usher her into the world of the dead. My mother was not what you would call a loving woman. My father left shortly after my birth, and my mother became a hateful, gin-soaked creature who lived to work, drink, and remind me of how worthless I was. I must thank her one day. She made me into the man I am. All those years of being told how I was garbage, a waste of space, and now I'd never amount to anything, had crafted me into a humble target for her to hurl her rage at. Until that one night when I'd finally had enough. She was dying. That was plain enough to see. It was a close race between the booze and the smokes to see who could come out on top. The arthritis was making a nuisance of itself as usual, and as I cut her meat, she continued to pick at my subconscious like a junkie picking at scabs. The meat wasn't cut small enough. Now it was cut too small. It was a funny shape, and what could she expect from a worthless pile of shit like me after all? She was ashamed of her weak, servile son, and if there was any justice in this world. But you know, I never found out what would happen if there was any justice in this world. At that moment, I had suffered all I meant to. I yelled for her to shut up, and I stuck the knife I'd been using to cut her meat into her chest. She looked up at me, and her eyes were so full of terror and wonder that I put the knife back in again. I'd stabbed her 5 times before she made a sound, and even that was unintelligible. A gurgling, incoherent sound that befit a formless hag like my mother, hand in glove. I moved her body and told the police she had come home drunk and attacked me. They let me collect her estate, such as it was, and I moved on. The only thing worthwhile that I ever had from her was the knowledge that I was good for at least one thing. He got up from the stool, and I tensed as I came out of my memories. He took a step for the door, but then changed his mind and walked to the bathroom instead. I settled myself and waved the waitress away when she starts to check on me. This was not the dying place I had planned for him, but I could feel his time getting close. I used the money I'd gotten from my mother's estates to travel. When I say travel, you probably think of planes or buses, but my mother's estate had mostly come in unpaid bills. $50 in a savings account, another $500 she'd hidden in the bookcase and forgotten about, and $1,500 in a life insurance policy I'd never known existed. I sold all the possessions she had left her debts unsettled, and melted into the exciting world of public vagrancy. I rode the rails, slept under bridges, and all the time I kept honing my craft. I killed a bum in New York that was found in a river later, his pockets holding $500 and a dirty picture of a woman. Then I found a junkie in Jersey, who I later found out had a wife and kids he'd been hiding his drug problem from. Then 2 prostitutes in Queens who had been sharing the same man without knowing it, and all the while me staying one step ahead of the authorities. The investigations weren't lengthy. These were street people, or people up to no good, and their investigations were forgettable. The one to matter since my mother was number 5. Number 5, we'll call him James, was a New York businessman with a dark secret than the money he laundered from the mob. I was back home for the first time in years when I bumped into James purely by mistake. Coming out of a bus station, he plowed into me on the sidewalk and barked at me to look where the hell I was going. Some people would have killed him right then and there, but that wasn't my way. The stalk was the biggest thrill for me. Soon I discovered that James had a little secret of his own. He used to pick up whores late at night in his fancy red sports car. He liked to take them to the docks, and after a little backseat back and forth, he would drug them and sell them to people who knew who would pay top dollar for good stock. These weren't mobsters either. These were men who could afford to make sure these women disappeared. Afterwards, he'd get high in his car and zone out as he thought his bleak thoughts had mellowed. He'd come back to reality pretty quick when I slid the knife across his throat. His eyes rolled up as I told him how bad he'd been as his life dribbled out down his cheap suit. The police found enough evidence in his briefcase to follow the paper trail, but I was long gone by then. My latest quarry returned from the bathroom and staggered towards the door again. After bumping into a few tables and accepting the scornful shouts and hard shoves from the patrons, he found the door and wrapped his hand around the handle. I started to rise, and then his friends called to him from the door, offering him just one more for the road. "Well, how can I say no to such a generous offer?" he asked, and wandered back to the bar for one more drink. Killing this one would be doing him a favor, just like number 18. Ah, number 18. Anna had been sweet enough to make me think about giving it all up and living a normal life. Too bad life is rarely that easy. During my travels, I caught pneumonia and was hospitalized for nearly a week. Anna was my nurse. She was the sweetest person I'd ever met, and after bringing me back from the brink of death, she found out I was homeless and wandering and invited me to stay with her until I could get back on my feet. I stayed with her for nearly a year, and the two of us became closer than we'd expected. In that year, I never once felt the urge to kill. We'd been planning our wedding when they diagnosed her with cancer. As she underwent chemotherapy, tried new diet after miracle cure, after experimental treatment, I went back to my old respite. That year, Chicago was hit by a serial killer. 9 victims in 9 months, but my 10th victim was the only one that mattered. On her deathbed, Anna told me she knew I was the killer. She'd followed me one night, putting her own health at risk. She said she had been certain I wasn't cheating on her. She saw me stab a man and push him into the canal. She was tired of living, tired of the pain, and she asked me to be her mercy angel. I gave her what she wanted. By the time the air bubble in her IV killed her, I was already gone. One for the road turned out to be more like 5. When my prey finally shuffled towards the door, I was there to hold it open for him. He thanked me in a slurry voice and stumbled out into the night, the king of the inebriates. I followed after him like a hungry wraith, and when he turned down an alley, I knew his time had come. I tucked my knife up in my sleeve and began to creep up behind him as I moved to the end of the alley. I heard his zipper go down, and as he sent a stream of piss arcing across the bricks, I stalked in quietly behind him. North Carolina was not my desired destination, but I'd enjoyed the 3 years I'd been here. After Anna, I was drunk more than I was sober. Beer when I had money, hobo brew when I didn't, and always I rode the rails from one place to another. I picked up work in Maine, drank my way to Philadelphia, sloshed my way back to Chicago, where I somehow drank my way into a drunk tank in Warren, North Carolina. After my release, I worked odd jobs for odd folks. I landed a steady gig as a day cook in a little greasy spoon diner, and only felt the urge to kill a few times. The people in Warren were good people, and the people I killed were bad people, people who had tainted that image. A rapist I knew from my days on the rails who blew into town and started doing his own stalking. A foul-mouthed drunk who kept driving after they took his license. A woman with a taste for married men. And finally, Mr. Ham here, number 23. Mr. Ham, though, he was the worst of the bunch. He hated the homeless with a passion, and I suspected that he had killed some of my fellow rail riders for imagined crimes. I had watched him for a week, marked his movements carefully, and now it was time to see him put away for good. I raised the knife as I came up behind him and prepared for the strike that would take him while he urinated. That's when he turned, and his arc of piss hit me full in the face. I stumbled backwards, momentarily blinded, and a solid blow took me to my knees. I toppled, legs hurting, and a heavy right struck me in the chest as I flailed to get back up. I wiped at my eyes, and there was Ham, towering over me. He was no longer looking quite so drunk. Perched on my chest like the world's ugliest gargoyle, he smiled down at me, looking like the cat that finally got the cream. I knew you were watching me all this time, so I thought I'd see what your intentions were. I suspected you were trying to kill me. Kind calls to kind, after all. But I do have one question before I kill you. The tip of my own knife pressed against my throat. How many lives have you counted? I didn't have to ask what he meant. You would have been 23. He leaned in, wishing to impart a secret before the end, and whispered, You will be my 44th.
It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I honestly have no explanation for it. My boyfriend and I were on a bit of a road trip, traveling to see my parents the next state over. They had never met him, despite the two of us having dated for almost 2 years. He had proposed to me the week before, my mother seeing the pictures on Instagram, and she had asked when they were finally going to get to meet this mystery boy I intended to marry. I hated that I didn't get to see my mom as much these days. My dad and I had a bit of a falling out before I moved, but he was looking to reconcile, and I was looking for some closure before my marriage to the sweetest man I'd ever met. We were driving, the countryside sliding past, and I felt myself drifting off as I just sat there and took it in. Feeling like a little nap, babe? He asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I think I might close my eyes for a second or two. Well, okay. I'm gonna stop for some food soon. 20 winks at the most, he joked. I stuck my tongue out at him and let my eyes slip shut as I blocked out the cows and the green fields that went sliding past the window. When I opened my eyes, the landscape was very different. The sky was red, like burnt red, the color of a jack-o'-lantern, and it seemed to be crackling with heat lightning as I watched. Something was falling from it, something bright that trailed a long tail. They almost looked like comets, but they were too close. We were on the road, but it was pitted and old. The concrete was flaked and peeling, and the landscape was eroded and rocky. Despite this, yellow crops grew from the arid soil, and I could see strange brown creatures with bloated bodies moving along on scaly legs. None of it was right. We should be traveling through Midwestern farmland, and the lightning was rumbling again. I saw it hit the ground and leave a crater amidst the too dry vegetation. I looked to Brad for some kind of answers, but as upsetting as the landscape was, Brad was the most upsetting thing about this, whatever it was. He stared ahead, eyes on the road, as he sat stock still and stared through the window as if it were completely normal. Brad? What the hell, where the hell are we? He stared ahead and said nothing. Brad, what's going on? He stared ahead, and as I watched, something seemed to move beneath his cheek. I was scared. He was so still, but I found myself unable to look away. Brad was a joker, but he didn't usually joke like this. This was different. This was making me very afraid, and I started to worry about something being wrong with him. Then, ever so slightly, he turned his head, and I found myself wishing he had just stayed facing forward. His eyes were jet black, too big and starey. His face was locked in the rictus of a smile, and it seemed he was having some sort of fit. His skin was moving, writhing, and as I watched, a large black beetle slid from his mouth and scuttled into his ear. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me. I became aware of how quiet it was, only the thunder making any noise as it struck outside the window. And the silence was a whole other monster that lurked. It became claustrophobic, like those parts in a horror movie where you're waiting for the monster to scream and scare you so you can just get on with the story. The scream never came. The scare never happened, and I just sat and looked at this thing as it drove us towards wherever we were going. As we sat staring at each other, however, the car was invaded by the sound of a loud, cavernous scream. I turned in time to see our vehicle barreling towards something large and gray that was walking laboriously across the road. I only saw it for a split second, but it was huge, and the thing we were careening towards was a leg that seemed to take up the whole road. Its skin was craggy, like a living mountain, and as it tried to ponderously get its bulk out of the road, we hit it squarely, and the car made a sound like an angry animal. The crash happened in slow motion. The vehicle's front crunched in, lifting us off the ground as the windshield bulged in. The bubble slowly grew before bursting, pushing inward like a rising wave. The glass shattered out like a cascade of beautiful diamonds as it pelted toward my face. Through it all, those dark eyes glared into my soul. He maintained eye contact until I woke up, screaming as the pain radiated up my face. I heard a screech of tires and an angry exclamation from my boyfriend as I came to. The car swerved back onto the road, and I clutched my nose and screamed. The pain was instant and mind-numbing, shooting agony that radiated through my nose and spread through my face. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going on. Through my tear-streaked eyes, I could see that everything was back to the way it was before I dozed off. Had it all been a dream? My throbbing nose kind of made me think that it had been real. The pain was becoming too much, and I begged him to take me to a hospital. He obliged as best he could, and 20 minutes later, we walked into the ER lobby in the nearest town. It was a slow day, I suppose, because they let us back and asked me questions as I helped them fill out paperwork. They didn't leave us sitting in the room for long either. In no time at all, someone was taking my hand off my face, and my boyfriend was holding my arms to keep me from trying to cover it again. I wanted to cover my face again badly, my nose a white-hot ball of agony, and the touch of Brad's hand was making me shudder. I couldn't look at him, because despite knowing that it was a dream, all I could see was that bug-filled creature with dead eyes looking back at me. The doctor looked into my left nostril with a light and furrowed his brow. That's weird. Hold very still for a second. Brad held me, wrapping his body around me, which only made me shudder worse, as the doctor reached into my nose and pulled something out that seemed to cut me as it came free. My nose hurt all the worse, like it was being sliced with a razor blade, and as it came free of my nose, I could see that it had been what was causing me the pain. It glittered wetly, red drops dappling the edges of the object as it slid out into the light of day. It was a shard of glass, about as long as my pinky tip, and nearly as wide. They had a lot of questions I couldn't answer, and Brad was utterly bewildered as to how it had gotten in my nose in the first place. I can't explain it myself. It was as if I had dozed off perfectly fine and woke up with a huge piece of glass in my face. I told them about the dream, but that didn't seem to convince them in the least bit. I simply gained a giant piece of glass somehow. No one seems to be able to tell me why. That's why I'm writing this, honestly. I sent Brad out to get me some clothes from the car, but I don't know if I can even get back in the car with him. Sometimes he looks normal, but sometimes, just for a second, I can see that weird thing staring out of his face. The other subs I put this in seem to think it was a joke, but you guys seem to appreciate weird stuff, so any advice would be greatly appreciated. I just don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to drive for another 2 hours with him. I don't know what's going on or if I'll ever get over this. I don't know what I'm gonna do. They won't stop pounding on the door. They won't stop calling my name. And before long, someone with keys is gonna come along and unlock my office. I don't know what to do. Completely out of my element here. And all my brain can come back to is that coffee. The coffee. The goddamn coffee. "First cup of the morning?" he'd asked, and all I could do was smile at him. He must be new. Because if he'd been here longer than a week, he'd know how often I show up to this machine. I stood before the coffee pot like a worshiper at the altar, and as the savory black liquid spilled into the pot, I felt my mouth water at the thought of coffee. First cup. Yeah, right. I started my day with the taste of warm, fresh brewed coffee. As I'd cooked my breakfast, I'd had another, savoring this one a little, as I never did the first cup. And as I sat down to catch up on my emails, I drank a third as I ate my breakfast. I'd had another one on the way to work, savoring the aroma as I sat in traffic, and now it was time to get a cup before I sat down for another day of work. First cup. Try fifth. I've been like this since my late teens. My mother was a career nurse who drank coffee by the pot, not the cup. As a single mother trying to keep up with an active son, there was never a time I can't remember when coffee wasn't part of our lives. When I was just a tyke, my mom was always running late due to my inability to get moving in the morning. No one wants to lose their job because their kid can't get ready on time, so one morning, she gave me a sippy cup of coffee, sweetened with milk and sugar. No surprise, I took to it like a fish to water. The other parents looked at her funny when she told them. She heard the usual sermons about how coffee would stunt my growth and make me hyper, but she always felt she knew better. The fact that I was never prone to hyperactivity and grew to top out about 6 feet seemed to have proven their worries were groundless. Coffee is life for me. It runs through my veins, and I always joke that when I die, I'm going to donate my body to Starbucks. I can be their flavor of the month. That cup looks a little rough, don't you think? I turned to see Chuck wander into the break room then, unrecognizable health smoothie in his "My Body is a Temple" shaker cup. The new guy greeted him as he came in, and I extended my hand for a fist bump. As he met my knuckles with his, I couldn't help but shudder a little at how scaly and clammy his skin always is. You'd think with all that rabbit food he ate that those healthy shakes would make his skin a little softer, or at least clear up his skin condition. It's got character, Chuck, unlike whatever you're drinking there. Chuck laughed. If character is what you call mushrooms growing in the bottom of that thing. He was right. Not about the mushrooms, but about the state of my cup. I'd had this cup for 3 years, and in that time, I had never once bothered to wash it. The outside was a little stained up, but otherwise looked pretty normal. The inside, however, was a dark cauldron of old coffee stains and filth. It didn't look that bad to me, but of course, I had gotten used to it by now. I always justified it by telling myself that I was putting boiling water into it, so anything living in there was likely to get boiled out of existence by the time I got around to drinking the coffee. I had no idea what I was setting myself up for. The hot liquid splashed into the cup with a luxuriant sound. I swirled the contents around in the cup before taking a test sip and gasping in pain. It was much too hot, but I had known that already. I talked with Chuck a few more minutes, and when Mr. Ryan strode into the break room, we all said our goodbyes and left for our desk. Mr. Ryan's was a fantastic boss, but he had a very narrow opinion on dawdling and socializing on company time. I said hi to a few other people in my hall and stopped at Rob's door to pass a few words. He was hard at it already, and I could see his tongue sticking out through his teeth, a nervous habit he said he'd had since elementary school. His dark hair looked sweaty, and when I asked him if he was okay, he said he had to make an 8 o'clock deadline, but maybe he could catch up at lunch. I said that sounded great, and as I walked to my office, I saw that Lisa was already behind her computer as well. Lisa was a mousy new girl that had moved into the office across from mine a few months ago. She was about my age, with straight brown hair that she always piled neatly on her head, and she had a cute pair of black glasses that were constantly needing to be pushed up the bridge of her nose. She didn't say much, but we waved at each other most mornings, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't have just a little bit of a crush on her. She waved back, smiling in her shy way, and went back to work as I stepped into my office and closed the door. I sat the coffee on my desk and turned on my computer as I prepared to start another day. I'm an IT specialist, so my job is mostly fixing other people's problems. There was an email already from Janice about how her monitor wouldn't come on, and another from Steven about how his issues with the network had gotten out of hand again. I sipped my coffee as I read these, testing the hot liquid with my lips before committing to the sip. I reached for the phone so I could call Janice. Janice was a frequent caller. The IT guy before me had thought it was funny to give her the most ancient of our relic computers. I'd been keeping that dinosaur running for years now, and every time the budget committee told me they didn't have enough money for a new computer, I died a little inside. I called Steven, and after a few questions, it became apparent that his problem was of his own making again. He'd opened another questionable email, and now his computer wouldn't link to the network. That was by design. Steven was notorious for opening anything that found its way into his inbox. He'd brought the network down several times with this sort of behavior, and I logged in remotely to revert it to a previous state, which solved the problem. The virus hadn't been that aggressive, it seemed, and he thanked me for helping him. I reached for my cup and found that it was empty. I'd been sipping the coffee while I was on the phone with Steven, and I'd drank more than expected, I guess. I called Janice and asked her what was going on with her computer, and after a few sentences, I reached into the drawer and found a new power cord. The computers seemed to burn through them for some reason, and I'd recently made a note to keep them in stock. I locked my computer, grabbed my coffee cup, and figured I'd stop for a fresh cup on the way to Janice's office. I stepped out into the hallway, turned left, and stopped dead in my tracks. My cup shattered on the carpeted floor, and that drew the creature's attention at the end of the hallway. It was hideous. It had a bulbous gray head that was covered in coarse black hair, and the small white eyes that dotted its head were awful looking. Its jaw lolled open to reveal a mouthful of sewing needle teeth and a flicking red tongue that constantly moved over them. It was dressed in a white button-up shirt and a pair of black slacks, but the shirt bulged with coarse black hair, and the pants looked to be barely containing its oddly shaped legs. It looked at me, and for a second, eyes blinked in an odd succession before it raised a hand to ask if I was okay. I shuddered and felt my knees unhinge as I slid to the wall. It sounded like Rob. Rob's voice was coming out of this creature's mouth, and as it did, I could feel my mind slipping a little. What the hell was going on? Had I been drugged? Were they playing a trick on me? As the Rob creature made its way up the hall, I saw another thing stick its head out of the break room. It looked like an enormous bat head stuck in a business suit, and in one clawed, scaly hand, it held something that looked like Chuck's smoothie shaker. He didn't even look real. The creature looked like a photorealistic movie monster, or images from a horror site when someone has drawn creatures that just look a little too real. As the Rob creature got closer, I could see small sores on its skin, long curly hairs sprouting in places between its eyes, and I felt a scream ripping its way up my throat. The Chuck creature blinked his two big eyes at me. "What's wrong? You okay?" It came blundering out of the break room and towards me, and I felt my legs finally take orders as I backpedaled towards the exit door. It was 30 feet away, down several hallways, but I felt like I was motivated enough to run a mile in a minute flat. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong, and until I knew what was going on, I wasn't sure I could trust any of my senses. I had come to my office door when my back met resistance, and I realized I had bumped into someone. I turned my head woodenly to see what new horror I had blundered into, and I felt a fresh scream rip through me. It was a spider, a giant spider, but with a body on top of its abdomen like some fantasy creature from a video game. Its torso was vaguely feminine, breasts poking from beneath a blue cardigan that hung over its shoulders. Its 8 chitinous legs clicked on the floor as it took a step backwards to assess me. It looked at me with familiarity, and I could see that it had shiny black hair piled on its head above its 8 rotating eyes. 2 eyes seemed to be covered by thin metal glasses, and I blundered towards my door as I realized who it was. the spider thing was Lisa. Sorry, are you okay? I didn't mean to. I didn't let her finish. I pushed my way into my office and slammed the door behind me. I locked the handle, pushed my chair under it, and cringed against the farthest wall I could get to. What in the hell was going on? Had that been real? What was I seeing out there? That couldn't be my colleagues, could it? They had sounded like them, even sort of acted like them, but the creatures out there had been so nightmarish that I couldn't even process it. All I could do was huddle under my desk, knees pulled up to my chest, and try not to cry as someone knocked on the door. "You okay in there?" It was Chuck. "You scared Lisa half to death, man. I think she's crying in her office right now. Maybe you could come apologize?" I stiffened. Lisa was crying. Had I done that? I couldn't bear the thought that I had made Lisa cry. I had half risen from under my desk when I'd finally gotten hold of myself again. This wasn't real. The monsters were trying to trick me so they could get me out of my office. I sat back down under my desk and squeezed my knees against my chest again. They wouldn't trick me like that. I wasn't going to be fooled so easily. Chuck banged on the door, harder this time, and asked what my problem was. Rob's voice made an appearance as well, and he apologized for startling me. They were worried about me and wanted me to come out so they could sort through this. They were scared for me and wanted to see me. They got angry at how I was acting and started banging louder all the while. I just huddled under my desk and sobbed quietly. I couldn't process what was going on or why this was happening, and all the avenues seemed to come back to the coffee. Someone had drugged me. Someone was messing with me. Someone had done this to make me freak out. But why? That was when the phone rang. It jangled merrily in the cradle, unaware of the horror show that was just outside the door. I looked up over the edge of my desk like a cartoon mouse peeking out of his hole. I almost expected the phone to grow fangs or sprout eyes, but it didn't. It just continued to be an average black plastic phone. I reached out shakily for it, and as my sweaty hands settled around it, I felt it solidify and had second thoughts about my perception. My desk was still here. My computer still hummed peacefully. If this was a world for monsters, then how could all these things exist? How would a monster type with big clawed hands? How would he sit in a normal chair? How would he pick up the phone? As I picked up the phone, I heard Mr. Ryan's calm voice wash over me. It took me a minute to realize that he was calling my name as I was just sitting there in the calm warmth of my realization. "Hello, sir?" I said, and my voice shook a little. "Are you okay?" His voice was calm and rich and made me feel like control had been restored. I don't know, sir. I'm seeing some weird stuff. Have you imbibed any substances today? It's okay if you have. I just want to know how we can help you. I just had a cup of coffee in the break room and coffee at home. I was fine when I got here, sir, and now I don't know what's going on. I'll be there in a few minutes. Just wait. And he hung up before I could tell him about the monsters. I hung up the phone and sat huddled under my desk. He wouldn't be able to get here, not with the monsters out there, and even if he could, would he be normal? Maybe this was just another trick by the monsters. I sat under my desk, shuddering and waiting for the creatures to break down my door and get me. They had stopped banging and shouting, but I could still hear them scuttling around out there. They were waiting, just waiting for me to drop my guard. Then they'd have me. 4 loud knocks made me jump and hit my head on the desk. "It's Mr. Rhines. Open the door, please, so we can talk about this." I slunk from under my desk, looking for all the world like a scared rabbit as I approached the door like I thought it might explode. Are the monsters gone?" He didn't answer right away, probably hoping he had misheard me. "Monsters?" I put my mouth close to the door jamb and whispered, "The monsters are out in the hall." No monsters. Why don't you let me in so we can talk about all this and get everything straightened out? Your friends and co-workers are worried about you, and are anxious to get this sorted out. My hand shook as I set it on the doorknob. I must have been wrong. Maybe I just had a psychotic incident or something. Now everything was back to normal. I had acted like an ass and scared the hell out of everyone. It was time to go face the music, maybe find out what all this was about, and as I wrapped my hand around the knob, I was sure that everything would be back to normal when I opened the door. As the door came open, the worst horror of all was waiting for me. He was a demon. His skin was the color of burnt pork and was awash with cracks and blisters that opened and oozed as he stood before me. His hands were cruel claws sprouting from the cuffs of his Armani suit, and his wings extended like a miasma behind him. His face was a wide, lolling mouth, eyeless and earless, with a massive set of ram's horns that curled above the door jamb as he hulked in it. When he opened his mouth, I heard the voice of Satan himself, the lilting voice that invited Eve to eat an apple, and I knew that I would never be able to deny him if he spoke. Now, let's see what all this is. I slammed the door in his face, and they've been banging at it for nearly 30 minutes. So here I sit, writing my experience in the hopes that someone will take something from this before they burst through the door and get me. As I write, though, a sobering feeling has occurred to me. There's a mirror in my desk. As I write this, I can't help but look at the drawer and fight the urge to pull it out. As I sit here panicked, afraid that I have somehow found myself in a world of monsters, I never stop to think that maybe the problem is me. Maybe I've lived inside a delusion my whole life. Something in that odd cup of coffee triggered me to see the world for what it really is. Could it be possible that if I were to take that mirror out and look at myself, I could see my own scales and fangs and slime as well? Could it be that somehow the veil has been pulled away and I'm finally seeing the world for what it really is? I guess the lesson here is this: maybe a little soap and water is cheaper than the loss of your own sanity, and maybe I should have listened when they told me to clean my damn cup. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. Looks like it's time to thank our patrons again. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to join us on Patreon, come on down and join our Spooky Skeleton tier contribution tier. Or maybe you're a fellow writer of the spooky and you'd like to read my stories on your channel. Come become one of our Ghostwriter tier contributors so you can read all the stories you want for only $10 a month. Or just come back next week for another listen. And as always,
Rachel, are you sitting right in front of that television again? Came her mother's high, reedy voice from the kitchen. No, Rachel called back, her voice incredulous, as if her mom would just assume something like that. Like she'd just hear the TV, always television to her, and always in the tone of deepest scorn, and assume that Rachel was sitting 5 feet from it. In truth, it would have likely been easier to split the atom than slide a piece of notebook paper between Rachel's face and the murky glow of the old television set. Like most of the children who had reached the age of 10 in this time of technological marvels, Rachel found her entire world balanced within the glow of that box. In it were held the 500 TV channels of her life: sports, cartoons, news, cartoons, current events, cartoons, and the scary movies that her mother would have had a fit if she knew she were watching. Rachel quickly spooled the channels through to the 5 or 6 that showed scary movies, being careful to move the volume down to 2 little green bumps that would ensure her mother didn't hear the TV. Her mother would have an absolute coronary if she knew Rachel was watching anything that wasn't approved family television by the Council for Moral and Ethical Values. Even in her head, Rachel always assumed this name was delivered in a reedy, nasal voice of a cultured and obviously boring old man. The whole town was like that, so caught up in their own ancient sense of what was right and wrong that they didn't seem to understand that times were changing. It was like Burrow was caught in the 50s sometimes. All the kids in town lived on their TVs. It was just a way of life.
She spooled through the TV guide and saw that 3 movies were playing later that she wanted to see. Carrie was playing at 10:30, but that was much too soon. Her mother might be good and asleep by 11, but not by 10:30. The other channel, however, was showing Child's Play at 10:30, followed by something called Darkhaven. As she read the description, she knew that Darkhaven was the one she wanted to see tonight. The description sounded pretty cool, and it promised a true scare not often found in modern horror. The runtime was just over an hour, too, so even if her mom woke up at 2, as she was sometimes wont to do, she could easily be back in bed and well asleep before. And what is this? Rachel squeaked a little, and the remote clattered to the floor. Batteries rolled hither and thither as the back cover came off, and she turned her head to see her mother hovering over her. Rachel's mother wasn't an unattractive woman, but the worry lines and stress a pair of jobs brought on her had worn her down before her time. She now stood, legs spread in a linebacker's blocking stance, with her thick blonde hair thrown hastily into a messy tail, and her hands covered in the remains of tonight's dinner dish suds. Her face wasn't set cruelly, despite what Rachel thought. She'd never once seen anything more than parental displeasure from her mother. She was wearing the stern look she reserved just for Rachel, though, it seemed. "Nothing," Rachel said again. Just trying to give herself nightmares for the next 500 years, she said as she bent down and pushed the button on the front of the TV. It went off with a little staticky smack sound that reduced it to nothing but a dumb, lifeless box. "Off to bed now. It's well past your bedtime. The idea that I'd allow such filth in my—" But Rachel had listened to just about as much as she cared to of that. She'd frozen on the bottom step like a ballet dancer, preparing for her opening move. And what an opening move this was likely to be. "They aren't filth, Mother. I happen to like horror movies. If you weren't so close-minded, maybe you'd find out that you like them too." Her mother's stern face had flushed red at that, the deep scarlet it always turned before the two had one of their more and more common arguments. "Don't you dare take that short tone with me, young lady. This is still my house, and as long as you live in my house, you will follow my rules, and you can forget about TV for 2 days because of your sass." Rachel was affronted. But that's not fair. What am I supposed to do for 2 days? There's nothing else to do in this stupid town. No one ever wants to play outside or come over to visit. They all just want to watch TV. "Well, for 2 days, I guess you won't be one of them. Maybe you can be the first one to actually go out, and why don't you just admit it? Why don't you just admit that you hate me? Why don't you just admit that you love making my life miserable?" A silence hung between them for a minute. Rachel was walking down a dark path, but she didn't care. She knew that what she would do next would hurt her mother, hurt her worse than she'd ever hurt her before, but she didn't care. "And just where did you get an idea like that? Why would I hate you?" Her mother's voice was incredulous and low, as though it was all she could do to breathe out the words. "I heard you once, talking to Mrs. Dempsey, talking about all the things you'd do if only you didn't have children. All the exciting things the two of you would do if only you didn't have children at home to take care of. Well, why don't you just go and do them? Because I honestly wish that I didn't have a mother." She didn't even stop to see how deeply she had wounded her. She stormed upstairs and slammed her door shut between herself and the whole stupid world. She came awake all at once and looked over at the clock on her bedside table. 11:30 p.m. She couldn't believe she'd dozed off. What if she'd missed it? She'd already had to miss Child's Play thanks to her mother's stupid racket. She rolled away from the clock and couldn't help feeling sorry for her mother. She'd expected another fight, a longer punishment maybe. She might have even sassed her way into what her friends called a spanking, which her mother had never believed in. Instead, she'd just cried. Rachel had heard her climb the stairs from underneath her covers and was sure that the door would open any minute. Her mother would come storming in with a belt or a paddle or maybe even just her hand and a still glowering rage at her cheeky daughter. But instead, she just went to bed. She'd opened her door and flopped out onto the big bed she'd once shared with Rachel's father before he left, and began to cry. Rachel couldn't remember ever hearing her mother cry, not even when she was 3. Her father had left, saying it just wasn't working out. He didn't love Rachel's mother anymore, and hadn't even bothered to say anything to Rachel. For the better part of an hour, her mother had sobbed furiously, choked anguished sobs that she didn't think would ever end, at least until she'd heard them change into deep, rhythmic snores. This had been at about 10:05, but Rachel hadn't dared to sneak down to the TV. Her mother could be shamming, though Rachel didn't think she was. Rachel didn't want to risk missing the movie she really wanted to see because she had been too hasty. She'd seen Child's Play about 100 times anyway, and had decided to close her eyes just for a second when 11:35 p.m. She'd sneak down to the living room in about 20 minutes, just to make sure that her mother was still good and asleep. No sense spoiling it now by being overeager. She rolled over, and her guilt rolled with her. She shouldn't have said that to her mom. It wasn't fair, and thinking about it now, her mother probably meant nothing by it. Whose mother didn't want a life where they didn't have responsibilities or children? Rachel was mature enough to understand that, but 11:38 p.m. But it was still a rotten thing to say. Rachel was here, and her mother thinking that way made her feel like she didn't care whether she lived or died. And she was always such a bother anyway. Rachel, clean your room. Rachel, finish your vegetables. That's not appropriate subject matter for a child your age, Rachel. What did she know anyway? Who was she to judge what was and wasn't right for her to do? 11:39 p.m. Rachel rolled over angrily, and now time was being slow on purpose. She listened closely again and could still hear her mother's deep snoring from the other room. She could probably sneak down right now and catch the climactic ending of Child's Play. Her mother would never be the wiser. But no, Rachel wouldn't spoil it for a bad slasher flick ending that she'd seen 100 times. She'd bide her time until 11:41 p.m. She was sure that she could sneak down and not get caught. She felt her eyes getting heavy again and stifled a yawn. She would not get tired and fall asleep. That was not an option. She lasted this long, and she would last a little longer. She'd have to make sure she didn't fall asleep on the couch or something, like that one time a few months ago. Luckily, her mom hadn't woken up till nearly 7 after the storm had knocked the power out. The TV had been off, and all she'd been able to yell at her for was not waking her up and falling asleep on the couch. Oh, but hadn't that been a good night? Watching Ether Man during a rainstorm, and having to stifle a scream when the lightning had peeled out just as the knife slash had landed. 11:43 p.m. Rachel threw the covers off angrily. If time wasn't going to cooperate, then she'd just go ahead and risk it. She pulled on her fluffy pink slippers and her black bathrobe for night sneaking and opened the door to her room carefully. It gave 1 or 2 traitorous squeaks, but they were small ones. Her mother's breathing never altered in the least. She slunk carefully into the hallway, past her mother's door, and down the steps as she tried hard to avoid the loose 8th step. Finally, she was down in the living room. She flipped on the TV and was bathed instantly in its warm, staticky glow. It was on the right channel, too. Child's Play was just ending, the credits beginning to roll, and the volume was still at the right level for night watching. She reclined against the couch as she waited for the letters to glide slowly to an end. She folded over herself and took a pillow off the couch to rest her head against. As the last name spilled sluggishly by, the screen lit up with a short infomercial about stock in a growing business firm. She flipped on the info button and read the description of Darkhaven again. As the smiling cowboy-hatted speaker finally delivered his tagline, "So put your trust in smiling Walter Rigsby, and you'll see the returns growing like our condos." Then the screen went eerily dark for what felt like hours. When it lit again, it was panning in on a dark forest, probably one in New England or Maine, and Rachel was accosted by the creepy circus grind of the intro music. She sighed. She couldn't believe she'd be missing TV for 2 days because of a slop-budget late 70s B-movie. The production value looked shoddy, even to a 10-year-old, and the camera work looked like some guy with a camcorder had shot it. She shrugged. Might as well see how it played out. It was only an hour and change anyway. The story started slow. Some settlers on a boat were in a bad storm, one of those Christopher Columbus specials with masts and lots of wood. A man on board was writing to his wife about how he missed her and wished she'd come with him to the new colony. There was some flashbacks, him arguing with some other buckle hat guy and asking some others to leave with him. Then a guy burst into his cabin and told him he was needed on deck. The following scene had been a little cool. Some of the men that came up to help had been washed overboard as they tried to save the ship. The actors were doing a pretty good job of drowning as the boat sailed away, unable to rescue them, though they were certainly trying with all they had. It got boring again pretty quick after they landed. Lots of farming, lots of good moros and banter. There was one old woman they seemed to think was a witch, but they left her alone instead of burning her like they usually did in these types of movies. Rachel was starting to nod off when an Indian came into town one day.
accompanied by some equally as unbelievably white-looking Indians. He told the letter writer, who was their mayor or leader or something, that they had settled on sacred ground to the local tribe, and that they would have to move the town or suffer the Indians' wrath. This led to a good little stretch of Indians returning nightly to burn their houses and kill people. Believably kill people, too. When one Indian brave buried his tomahawk in one of the settlers, she wasn't honestly sure she could see the effects that made the blood splatter. The scalping looked pretty grisly, too, as did the horse dragging and the execution of the braves they caught during the attack. This progressed until the people of the village had gathered to try to find a way to stop the Indians from attacking Darkhaven. The Indians had called it Darkhaven in their native tongue, and so some of the settlers had taken to calling it that too. Rachel was interested by this point. The movie had turned out to be not only very gory, but also very grabbing. She couldn't remember why it had been boring before. Suddenly, every character seemed more than real, and every death was as real as it would have been if it had been one of her own family members. The village's salvation came from an unexpected source. The old witch woman turned out to have a book that told her how to call forth a terrible power. "He will crush the savages," she told them, "in exchange for a pure soul." The townspeople then, with little to no discussion it seemed, rushed out to find a virgin, despite the protests of their leader and the local priest. Rachel sat close, a paper's breadth between her and the TV. They took a young woman and strapped her to the ground. The old witch cackled as she drew around the sobbing girl in the dirt, and the woman screamed and writhed as she pulled at her chains. She begged them to release her, tears pouring down her face as the old hag began to work her magic. The townspeople, for their part, mostly just stood around and looked somber and embarrassed. They didn't seem to know what to do here, and as the witch's spell began, many seemed to have second thoughts. It was too late, though. The drawing in the dirt began to glow painfully bright, and thrum in a dark crystalline purple that made Rachel squint. The woman screamed and screamed as the black ooze spilled from the ground. The ooze rolled over her dress, up her legs, and slid into her mouth with... The scene suddenly turned to snow. Signal lost. "No!" Rachel howled, throwing a hand over her mouth a second later to stifle the furious scream that would have followed. She began to pound her fist on the glass eye that so cruelly cheated her. She began to scream as loud as she dared at this hateful little monster of glass and plastic. She hated it. It built her up, and then snatched her prize away at the last minute. She hated it so much she... Her hand made a wet sound as she struck the screen. She pulled her fist back and looked down at the darkened surface. What was that? She held it to the salt and pepper snow of the television and looked in confusion at the dark liquid on her fist. Was that mud? Is her hand covered in... Good God! As she looked down at the slick substance on the underside of her curled fist, it writhed and pulled away from her skin slightly. No, it was a trick of the light. It had to be. It had to be blood or something. She'd burst a vessel, slamming her stupid hand against the TV. That had to be it. It couldn't... Plop. She looked up. Plop. Something was falling out of the TV. Plop. Plop. Was it her blood? There seemed to be an awful lot of it. It pooled on the carpet before her eyes, coming out in rivulets from the staticky eye. It soaked into the thick tangle of shaggy carpet, and Rachel scuttled crab-like away from it. One huge piece fell from the center of the snow. It's quivering. It's beating, Rachel thought. She didn't know why she thought this until something solid floated to the top of the pool. It rolled drunkenly in the murk, and as it rolled, it began to pulsate, to throb, to send little ripples out from the pulsating mass. It was a heart. The goop began to move, congealing, and then lifting itself up bonelessly like a waterspout from the world's darkest puddle. It hung there looking at her as it studied her scared face. Though it had no eyes, she knew it looked. She felt her breath coming in stuttering skips as she stared into the scariest thing she had ever seen in her whole life. It wavered like the jello her mother sometimes made for dessert. Then one thin leg broke from the black surge and took a liquid step towards her. She was over the couch in a flash and watched as it buckled and fell juicily against the coffee table, full of old art books her mother had lovingly kept there. It splattered and covered the chintzy farmscape, but then drew itself back together quickly as it began to assume a more human form. Its arms and legs were too thin, its torso like one of those department store mannequins she'd seen in Woolworth's.
and its head was a vague oval with a sleek, featureless face. But still, she knew it saw her. Her fear grabbed her fully, but unlike most children, her fear always transferred into flight. She took to the stairs 3 at a time. She drove through her bedroom door and slammed it shut behind her. It rattled and buckled not a heartbeat later, and came open with a monstrous crunch. She was thrown like a rag doll across the room and onto her own bed. The creature was inside, already lunging towards her. It tripped on those 2 thin legs, though, and one of them connected with her beanbag chair. She leapt over it. She was out of her room again, slamming the door shut behind her as the creature gained its feet again. She ran to her mother's room, her fists sounding like cannon shots as she banged frantically on the door. "Mom! Mommy! Please! Help me!" Her mother, dressed in the same rumpled clothes she'd come home in, threw the door open, brandishing a long wooden bat as she came into the hallway. She looked left, looked right, and then dropped panting to clutch at Rachel. "Honey? Rachel, what's wrong?" "A man, a thing, it's in my room, it's... But then she realized with real terror that it hadn't followed her. Something that quick should have been through the door and after her in a heartbeat. She looked back at the closed door, and dread began to coil there. Why hadn't it come after her? Rachel's mother looked at the door, and then pushed her daughter behind her. "I'll go have a look. You stay here. Call 911 if something happens." "No, Mom, please. Please don't leave me. Let's go call them now, and they can..." But she was down the hall, and to the door faster than the creature could have even managed. Her mother put herself against the wall like a SWAT cop preparing to burst into a drug house. She brought her foot up and kicked the door, and Rachel cringed and closed her eyes, expecting the thing to leap on her mother, and 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. No screaming, no yelling, nothing. She opened her eyes and saw her mother walking around the room, checking in the closet, looking under the bed, behind the furniture. She had turned on the lights, and with it, it didn't seem half so scary as it had a minute ago. Her mother swept the entire room 3 times, baseball bat at the ready, but after the 3rd time, she shrugged and turned back to her still shivering daughter. "Well, no boogeymen, Rachel, no monsters, no shadows, but I did find this little creature waiting patiently for you to stumble over him." She held out a well-worn teddy that Rachel had had since she was a baby. She'd put it on top of her closet. It seemed childish to have something like that on her bed at her age, but she was honestly glad to see it now. Her mother smiled and took a step towards the door. "Look who doesn't need a mother now, huh?" she said, not in her snippy ha-ha voice, but in her warm mother voice Rachel had heard less and less of these days, and would never hear again. Before she made it halfway to the threshold, the light on her table popped off with a smell like burning plastic. Rachel's mother turned to look at it, her face now cut in half by the darkness, but only Rachel saw the thin sliver of darkness that wrapped lovingly around her ankle. Her mother registered it a moment before it went taut as a noose, and Rachel saw a sad mix of terror, regret, and savage resolve to fight anything that threatened her child. Surprise and bemusement at the thought of being so vulnerable in her own home snap across her mother's face. "Rachel," she said, before she was dragged bonelessly to the floor and pulled, hardwood ribbons rising from her fingernails, under the bed. The baseball bat made a queer hollow plink as it hit the floor, a heartbeat before that ragged old bear. By then, though, her mother had disappeared an eternity ago to her daughter's eyes, into the inky blackness beneath her bed. The door slammed, and Rachel was left alone in the hallway. Have you ever had a dream, maybe a memory from your childhood, so vivid that it almost has to be real? I'm not sure if this actually happened or not, but I've dreamed about it for the last 2 weeks, and I'm terrified that it will never stop. Whenever I close my eyes, it begins again, and each time, it's more vivid than the last. This isn't normal for me. Most days I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, much less every detail of the dreams I had last night. But I can tell you every single detail of this event as though it happened just a second ago. It's the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my 30 years of life. And if it doesn't stop soon, I don't know what I'll do. I was 8 years old when I knew what terror really was. Miss Winkler was teaching us math, her blackboard covered in numbers and mathematical symbols, when my hand came up, my chubby fingers tickling the sky in anticipation. She'd been trying to engage us for about 45 minutes, enticing slivers of answers out of kids who'd rather be playing outside or pretending to be Power Rangers. When my hand came up, she looked so hopeful. Maybe she thought she had finally reached a student, perhaps. Maybe she thought she'd finally had a breakthrough, and a student would begin to return her answers to her. When she called on me, I can still see the hopeful smile that stretched her painted lips as she said my name with great expectation. Unfortunately, I was about to break her heart. "Can I go to the bathroom, Miss Winkler?" I asked in my high, innocent voice. Her face fell, and as an adult, I can understand that disappointment. "Yes, take the hall pass when you go." The hall pass was a ruler with the word "hall pass" written on it in magic marker. It was smudged from many dirty hands, and as I took it up and left the room, my adult mind wondered how many other hands had touched it over the years. As a kid, all I had wondered about was whether or not I could use it as a convincing lightsaber. I suppose kids do have different priorities, don't they? I swished and buzzed it all the way to the bathroom, and as I came up to the squat little building, I felt nothing besides a need to pee. The brick building was large enough to hold 2 bathrooms, a boys' and a girls', and 4 students comfortably inside each. I remember it being cold and damp in the winter, but I thought it would be mercifully cool on this blistering summer day. As I pushed the door open, I felt cold air ruffle my hair. Today, though, something didn't feel quite right about this place. The darkness was oppressive, pervasive, and even as a child I could feel that something was different. I reached inside and groped for the light switch. My hand slid over the slimy walls but found nothing. I knew there should be a light switch here, but as I scrambled my hand over the moist tiles, I became more and more aware of how badly I needed to pee. I finally decided to just go use the stall in the dark, the dingy windows letting in enough light that I wouldn't be in complete darkness. The door swung shut behind me. I felt the air pull it closed very hard, and the sound echoed off the bathroom walls. The dingy windows showed me 2 urinals and 2 walled-off toilet stalls. I went into one of the stalls, always feeling more comfortable sitting down to use the bathroom, and got comfortable as my bladder began to empty itself. As I started to do my business, I became aware of the strange noise from the stall next to me. The stalls were made of concrete blocks, painted glossy white, but they were not entirely built into the floor. There was a small opening at the bottom, about a foot high, where you could see into the stall next door. As I sat in the greasy semi-light, I heard the sound like mud dripping onto the floor. Every 5 seconds, it would glop, glop, glop onto the floor. Underneath the sound was another, softer, wetter, heavy breathing that was so low it was almost inaudible. I had finished using the bathroom by this point, but the sound mesmerized me. I had never heard anything like it, and I was fascinated and terrified to see what made a sound like that. Slowly I bent down so I could look under the wall, too afraid to simply go open the stall and see what was in there. As my knees bent to the cold concrete and my hands splayed over the rough floor, I brought my eyes down to peek and saw something that I will never forget. If it was dingy dark in my stall, then it was nearly pitch black in the other. As my eyes adjusted, I could see something on the other side that looked like nothing so much as rippling mud or swaying pudding. It was a mass, a wiggling mass of something that nearly blocked out the entire opening. As I watched, it rippled and shook endlessly as the sound of wet, labored breathing only got louder. Before long, it was more than background noise. It covered the dripping gloop with its damp and difficult chorus. I couldn't look away. I couldn't drag myself away from it until something round and angry floated through the muck and seemed to see me seeing it. It was an eye. I was up in a heartbeat, legs drawn up to my chest as I sat on the toilet and clutched myself. I held the ruler to my chest like a makeshift weapon and tried to silence my growing terror as the breathing became growly and agitated. The door burst open on the other stall, and I thanked my lucky stars that I had remembered to lock the door to my own cubicle before starting my business. Whatever was on the other side banged against the door. It sounded like waves crashing against a levee, and all I could do was cower and try not to scream, worried it might excite the creature and push it to further violence. It slammed in again and again, and as it did, I almost thought I could feel flecks of whatever it was made of slapping off and splatting on the ceiling and floor. It battered the door mercilessly, and to my horror, I could see the simple slide lock joggling and shuddering under every blow. The sound it made was like a mudslide, like mud pushing its way through a hallway during a flood, and I just knew that any minute it would break the door and cover me. Then, it stopped. Whatever it was gave one final slap against the door, and then rumbled off out of the bathroom. I sat petrified, unable to move for nearly 5 minutes before I finally found myself able to control my shaking legs. It was gone. Whatever it was gone, but I wanted it to be gone and well gone before I decided to come out. The lock didn't want to open, but it popped open after a few hard slaps with my hand. The door creaked outward on warped hinges, and I could tell that the cubicle door was definitely going to need replacing. As I turned to look at it, I could see several dark stains on the outside where something had slammed its soupy body into it again and again. Something dripped onto my shoulder, and my scream peeled off the walls like a startled bird. I scuttled back on crab legs. My knees had buckled, and I watched as something thick and muddy dripped off the ceiling and fell onto the cracked tile. I looked up to see a dozen or more little stalagmites, or maybe they were stalactites, hanging from the ceiling. They oozed and threatened to fall, their creation having taken place very recently. At that moment, all I wanted to do was get out, to escape, but I should have known that it wouldn't be that easy. When I pushed the door open, it didn't swing out onto the yellowing grass of my school sports field, but onto a shadowy hellscape of swirling lights and acrid smells. My child's mind didn't understand everything, didn't even understand some of the things, but it did understand that there were many moving mountains out there that made the one in the bathroom look like an anthill. The smaller ones congregated around towering fires, the dusty brown earth scraped shiny by their passing, and around them seemed to grind mountains that towered up into the greasy sky. Their tops were illuminated by infrequent forks of lightning. I could see towering rock sentinels made of ever-flowing viscous earth. It was too much. I closed the door and crumpled into a corner between the dripping sink and the wall. I made myself as small as possible. I felt as a bug must feel when it's surrounded by humans, and as my mind tried to process what I had seen, I seemed on the verge of breaking. How could I process something so big without going insane? The smallest of them had been barely able to be contained by this building. The largest of them could have destroyed this building without thinking. My mind could not fathom the sheer size of them, the knowledge of these moving mountains, so I did the only thing I could to keep myself from going insane. I put myself to sleep. The janitor found me there, and when he touched my shoulder, he said I fought and screamed like a cornered animal. He didn't mind, though. He was glad he had found me. It was night when he took me out of the little toilet building, and he had to be very firm with me to get me to go outside into the gloom. I was afraid it was a trick. The dark reminded me of the greasy blackness of that place, and it wasn't until my mother saw us coming out and ran to me that I knew I was back where I belonged. They took me to the principal's office. My dad, my teacher, the principal, the police officers, they were all waiting there for me. My dad hugged me, folding me into his warm embrace, and my teachers and principals asked me where I had been. When the janitor said he had found me in the toilet, my teacher seemed confused, and the police seemed aggravated. "You said you searched the entire school," said the principal, not just to my teacher, but also to the police officers. "We did. We even brought the dogs in. There's no way that kid's been in the bathroom for 2 days. My face must have shown how confused I was as I tried my best to follow the explanation. They told me I'd been missing for 2 days. The school had been searched, a Code Adam had been ongoing, and they had searched every place I liked and every friend's house I'd ever been to. I tried to tell them about the monsters, about the weird world full of giant things, but they just shook their heads and said I must have been hiding this whole time. I think my parents were just happy that I was safe, and the principal didn't punish me, even though I sensed that he really wanted to. I think my teacher believed me when I told her I wasn't hiding, holding the hall pass out to her in a shaky hand. She knew I was a good kid, and didn't usually cause more than the average 8-year-old's amount of trouble. She quit the next year, and I was removed from her class at my parents' request. When she saw me in the halls after that, I could swear that she looked almost sad to see me. I haven't thought about that place in years. After it happened, my parents took me to see a psychiatrist, and she helped me put it out of my mind. I would only remember it sometimes in the dark hours of the night, but it was gone just as quickly, even though it comes back in vivid detail, and I don't know how much longer I can handle it. I see the mountains moving as I stand in the doorway of that bathroom. I know that they will end me if they see me. I know that if they see a way to our world, they will end all of us, and I'm afraid of what I'll see the next time I open that door.